Beneath the rust of forgotten towns, hidden deep in the folds of America's past, there are stories that were never meant to be told, families who carried their secrets like a sickness, passing them down through generations until the line itself began to rot. This is one of those stories. A daughter who should have been protected became something else entirely. A child born into a family where bloodlines were not meant to cross but did, until the unimaginable happened. She did not marry a neighbor, nor a stranger, nor a boy from a distant town. She married her own father. Tonight, you will hear about the most inbred daughter in history, the sister who became a wife, the daughter who became her father's bride. But this story is not simply scandal or gossip. It is a descent into the very psychology of isolation, of desperation, of the dark hunger that grows when a family turns inwards and consumes itself. Imagine the walls of a cabin so tightly shut against the world that even the air seems recycled. Imagine a father who believed he was not only the ruler of his home, but the god of its blood. His children were not just children, they were property. And in that terrible silence of forgotten fields, he chose one. The girl who carried half his face, half his name. The girl who was told that love was not something to be sought outside the family, but only within. Her life became a tangle of confusion and obedience. She was told it was destiny, told it was sacred, told that no one else would ever understand her the way he did. But behind those words was something far darker, an erasure of her own self. She was not a daughter, not even a wife. She became a vessel, a tool to keep the family blood locked in a circle, spinning endlessly upon itself. The town whispered, of course. They saw the way the family never mingled, the way the girl's face carried a sadness too heavy for one so young. But in those times, in that part of America, people knew when to turn away, and so the story festered. It grew roots in silence. The daughter carried the weight of her father's sin like a stone chained to her body, sinking her deeper into a legacy that had already swallowed generations before her. This is not just the tale of one girl, it is the echo of a curse that repeats itself when families close their doors too tightly, when shame becomes stronger than mercy. And as we begin, you must ask yourself, how much truth can you bear to hear? She was 13 when it began, old enough to be seen as a woman in her father's eyes, yet still a child in every other sense. 13, the age when most girls were meant to be running in fields, giggling with friends, dreaming of lives outside the walls of their homes. But for her, the world had already been decided. There was no outside. Only him. It is difficult for us today to understand the crushing isolation that shaped her fate. The family lived far from town, tucked into the woods, where neighbors came only rarely, and the church was a distant sound carried faintly on the wind. Her father's word was law, and there was no law higher than his. He had kept his children close, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear that the outside world might expose the family for what it was. Fear that the blood he so carefully guarded might be diluted. So when he turned to his daughter and declared that she would be his wife, there was no one to stop him. Her brothers and sisters had been raised in the same silence, their eyes lowered, their voices small. They too had learned that to question him was dangerous, that obedience was the only way to survive, and the girl, fragile and frightened, did what children in such cages always do. She obeyed. The ceremony was not in a church. There were no witnesses dressed in Sunday best, no hymns sung to sanctify the union. Instead, it was a crude ritual performed in the shadow of the family home, under his voice, under his control. She was given words to say, words she didn't understand, words that shackled her in a role that blurred the lines between daughter and wife, child and woman, blood and blood. And yet even then, she must have known. Even then, she must have felt that something was terribly wrong. Because there are truths that no amount of isolation can kill. There are instincts older than any tradition, older than fear itself. Deep inside, she must have known that what was happening was a theft of her childhood, her innocence, her very identity. But she had no escape, no neighbors to confide in, no teachers to notice the change in her face. no relatives to intervene. In the silence of that house, her life was swallowed whole, and in marrying her father, she became part of a cycle that would not stop with her. The children came quickly, too quickly for someone so young, her body not yet fully grown, her mind still trapped between childhood games and the crushing weight of motherhood. Each birth marked her deeper, aging her before her time. The neighbors, those who dared to look too closely, saw a girl with hollowed eyes and a body bent from the strain of carrying children who should have been her siblings, not her sons and daughters. And the children themselves bore the marks of their lineage. Some were silent, withdrawn, their speech delayed or never forming at all. Others carried faces that seemed strangely doubled, features collapsing in on themselves as if the blood had folded too many times. The townspeople whispered of crossed eyes, of twisted jaws, of movements that didn't seem quite natural. They whispered, but never spoke too loudly, for they knew the father's temper and the shadow of his shotgun hanging by the door. Inside the home, it was worse. The girl, now called a wife, became little more than a servant to both her father and her children. She cooked, she cleaned, she bled, she bore, and still the cycle continued. The father, unashamed, told her this was her purpose, told her that the outside world was wicked, told her that only within the family could there be purity. But purity had rotted into sickness, and sickness had become their inheritance. One story from that time tells of a midwife who was once called to the home, summoned under the cover of night to deliver yet another child. She would later whisper that the girl looked more like a ghost than a mother, her skin pale and stretched, her lips trembling as she held the infant in her arms. The midwife never returned. She claimed the house itself felt cursed, heavy with a silence that pressed on her chest like a weight. And still, the girl endured. Not because she wanted to, not because she chose to, but because there was no other option. Survival meant submission. Survival meant swallowing the horror of what her life had become and carrying on as though it were normal. But every child she bore was a reminder of what had been stolen, a reminder of the line between father and husband erased forever. Generations later, people would speak of this family in hushed tones. They would describe them as shadows on the edge of the community, people you didn't look at too long, people whose blood was marked. And at the center of it all was her, the daughter who had been made a wife, the girl who became the mother of her father's children. By the time she reached her 20s, her face already carried the lines of a woman twice her age. Hard years had carved into her features, but it was the weight behind her eyes that told the true story. Those who caught a glimpse of her, walking to the well or hanging laundry behind the cabin, often remarked that she looked hollowed out, as though something essential had been scooped away and replaced with silence. She did not speak much. Some even said they had never heard her voice at all. But silence has a way of spreading. The children, born of her father's seed, carried it too. Some never learned to speak properly, their words tangled in their throats. Others avoided the outside world entirely, as if they knew instinctively that they were different, that they were not meant to be seen. The family became a living secret, a cluster of lives folded in upon themselves, each generation twisting tighter into the shape of the one before. The father, meanwhile, walked with the pride of a man who believed he had beaten the world at its own game. He had kept his family blood pure, untouched by outsiders, untouched by shame, at least in his own mind. He told his children they were chosen, special, set apart from the corruption beyond their fields, and yet the evidence of their suffering was written plainly across their bodies. The sloping shoulders, the bent bones, the vacant stares, nature itself was fighting against him, screaming through the broken vessels of his descendants. What is most chilling is not the father's arrogance, nor the girl's submission, but the complicity of silence around them. The neighbors who turned away, the church that never asked questions, the town that let the family retreat deeper into the woods, content to let the whispers remain whispers. In that neglect, the cycle was allowed to tighten its grip. Generations passed, and the truth became luber. A secret and more a curse woven into the soil itself. And still the girl endured. Though she was no longer a child, she remained trapped in the same role, her identity, daughter, wife, mother, all collapsed into one suffocating title: possession. Her story was not written in her own words, but in the children she bore, in the silence she carried, and in the legacy she could not escape. If you're still here listening to this story without turning away, you're already braver than most, because what comes next is the part that many would rather bury, the part that shows just how deep this legacy of silence cut, not just into one generation, but into many. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have walked away, or would you have been trapped too? The children of that cursed union did not scatter into the world. Most stayed close, bound not only by isolation, but by the mark their blood carried. Outsiders looked at them differently, sometimes with pity, often with disgust. Marriages outside the family were rare, and so, as years folded into decades, the same pattern began to repeat. Brothers and sisters pairing off, cousins bound together, each new generation carrying pieces of the old sin inside their very bones. And in every whisper, every rumor passed down in nearby towns, the same figure always emerged at the center: the daughter who became her father's wife. Her face, etched into memory, became a symbol of what happens when a family closes in on itself, when shame outweighs survival. People swore they could still see her walking the edge of the woods, carrying buckets to the well, her thin frame hunched, her eyes never lifting from the ground. The horror of her story is not just the crime of her father, it is the endurance of it. She lived decades in that prison, decades of childbirth, of silence, of watching her children bear the weight of deformities they never asked for. And though she must have known, deep inside, that this was not life as it was meant to be lived, the cycle chained her too tightly for escape. There are no records of her rebellion, no tales of her escape. Only a slow fading into the same soil where generations of her children would be buried. For her, life was not measured in moments of joy or freedom, but in seasons of survival, each one identical to the last. And as she aged, her children became her reflection. They carried her silence, her resignation, and her sorrow, as though the curse had carved itself into their very marrow. What began as one man's obsession had become an inheritance of misery, an inheritance no one asked to receive, but no one was allowed to refuse. By the end of her life, she had become less a person than a shadow. The girl who once played in the fields, who once might have dreamed of escape, was gone. In her place stood a woman worn down by decades of submission, her body frail from too many births, her spirit crushed beneath a legacy she never chose. She was buried without a marker, her grave blending into the earth as though the world itself wished to forget her. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. Her story lingered, carried in whispers and in the faces of her descendants. Those descendants became a living archive of what had been done. Some bore their heritage plainly, their bodies twisted, their minds clouded. Others carried it silently, with an unease that could never be spoken aloud. And in each one, there was a trace of her, the mother who was also a sister, the wife who was also a daughter. Her bloodline carried the evidence of a crime that had no end, looping back upon itself generation after generation. The tragedy is not only that she suffered, but that her suffering was normalized, hidden behind walls of silence and shame. This was not a single story. It was part of a pattern repeated in forgotten corners of America, where isolation became a prison, where families clung to themselves until the line collapsed inward. The girl who married her father was not alone. She was one chapter in a book that most refused to read, a book written in whispers, deformities, and graves without names. And yet in telling her story, we are forced to look at something many would rather turn away from: the cost of silence. Because it was not only her father who sealed her fate, it was the neighbors who did nothing, the church that looked the other way, the community that decided her suffering was easier to ignore than to confront. The soil of America holds countless secrets like hers, secrets buried deep but nevers. Gone. Perhaps the most haunting truth is this: her story could have been stopped. At any moment someone could have intervened, but no one did. And so her life became a monument to what happens when silence is chosen over action, when the cries of the innocent are drowned out by the comfort of denial. And so we arrive at the end, though endings in stories like this are never clean. Her life may have ended in silence, but the echoes did not. The daughter who married her father, the sister who became both mother and wife, left behind more than children. She left behind a curse, a living reminder that when a family devours itself, it leaves scars that cannot be hidden, even generations later. For those who came after, her name was rarely spoken. Families nearby would refer to her only in fragments. That girl, the one in the woods, the daughter who, as if even naming her aloud was dangerous, as if the shame of her story might bleed into their own. And yet, her face, her fate, lived on in the bodies of her descendants. You could see it in their hollow cheeks, in their wandering eyes, in the way they never seemed quite at ease with the world beyond their home. Her father, who believed he was protecting purity, had in truth planted poison. His obsession with bloodlines did not preserve his family, it destroyed them. Each generation born of his sin carried less strength, less hope, less chance of escape. His desire for control became a prison so complete that even the memory of the girl was locked inside it. But here, in this telling, her silence is finally broken. We remember not because it is comfortable, but because it is necessary. To forget her is to allow the pattern to repeat again, in other places, in other homes, where silence still reigns. Her story reminds us that the true horror is not the deformities of the body, but the deformities of the soul that arise when power is abused and innocence consumed. And maybe that is why her story still unsettles us, because it is not just a tale of one family in one forgotten town. It is a mirror, showing us what happens when shame replaces courage, when secrets replace truth, when silence replaces mercy. The daughter Wapuyurapis, who married her father, may be gone, but her story lingers in the soil of America like a ghost we cannot bury. If you've listened this far, you've walked with her through the shadows, through the silence, through the unthinkable. And now, as the past closes behind us, ask yourself, what is more terrifying? That this happened once, or that it could happen again?